Hello everyone, this is Tetrafolium, and I'm here today to bring to you part 2 of my team building series. This is going to be focused on what I'm calling the big three, which is three Pokemon that you kind of need to prepare for with every given team in this tier. I encourage you to check out part 0 and part 1 if you have not already, but assuming you have, we're going to go on. So a little bit of a summary of part 1. So we know how to support the initial concept of our team, and we know some common matchups to consider. This is going to be a little bit of a reminder, some of the top ranked Pokemon in the tier. Of course, this might shift around a little bit as the 2025 ADV viability rankings comes out, but I'm sure that it's going to be close enough that this is a good representation of what to deal with. And then we know we still have some work to do. So some of the work that we need to do is adjustments to our team. We might realize that there's something that is not working quite the way that we wanted it to on paper, and we might not have to make some little bit of tweaks to get the team to work the way that we want it to. As fun as it is to jump into the calculator and start optimizing your sets, we have to consider if the tools that we have are going to handle the common threats of a tier. Like, it doesn't do you much good to optimize a team that just loses to DD Tyranitar from the lead. You know, that, like, maybe you want to address that before you start saying, all right, I'm going to have a little bit more speed here and a little bit more defense here, you know? We want to consider offensive and defensive interactions when we're making adjustments to our team. Maybe we're going to change an entire Pokemon to help us with a certain matchup. Say, for example, your team doesn't have a good Pokemon for killing Metagross. Well, maybe you're going to consider Charizard. And Charizard will beat Metagross offensively speaking. Its Flamethrower and Fire Blast is super effective, do a lot of damage to Metagross. But if Metagross uses Agility, it's going to outspeed Zard, and it can win with a Rock Slide if it has it, or maybe a Boom. So there's a little bit of a visual for you. Sometimes you can't account for every matchup on both the offensive and defensive side, so you might have to make some compromises. For example, we might not have anything on our team that has grass coverage or can 2-hit KO a defensive Swampert, but we could maybe win a war of attrition if we're spamming status moves until the Swampert runs out of PP. So say, for example, if you have a team with Milotic plus Rest Zapdos that does not have HP Grass, then you can kind of switch back and forth between them, get some Toxics off, force this Swampert to use up all of its moves, and then you can beat it from there. Of course, that's great for a defensive-oriented team. If you're playing a more offensive-oriented team, you're probably going to have to figure out how to kill everything, because you can't have a Pokemon just wall your entire offensive team. That's going to kill your momentum. We'll discuss in greater details how to optimize, like going into the calculator and what to look for, and certain benchmarks as well. But I want to use this sort of as a jumping off point to talk about the three things that you absolutely need to consider for your teams before you even get too crazy with the adjustments. So consider these like the three adjustments you should be making first. So I don't know why I labeled this as 3 golden questions for ADV team building. That doesn't make a lot of sense. It's probably the golden question. Threefold. There are 3 forces that cannot be played around unless you have the proper tools in place, by my estimation, by some other people's estimation too, I would hope. The first is, can you deal with sand in the long term? Do you give Skarmory too much progress? And can you beat Blissey in the endgame? And now, note how I state these. It's not, can you beat Tyranitar? Can you beat Skarmory? Can you beat Blissey? It's more specific than that. It has to do with, at least for the first 2, some of the things that they do to you, not necessarily if you have a Pokemon that kills them. Blissey is a little bit more straightforward, but I specify in the end game for a particular reason. We're going to move on from this, but keep these in mind as we go. So rule number 1, our matchup versus sand. The big misconception here is this has nothing to do with how a team does versus Tyranitar, the Pokemon. For example, let's take this team. This is not like a real team. It's just 6 Pokemon I slapped together for the sake of demonstration. But think about all 6 of these Pokemon and how they deal with Tyranitar. Lead Breloom is going to threaten a Spore, or it could even go for Sky Uppercut to just kill a lead Tyranitar. It could also come back in later in the game and threaten with a Mach Punch. Fortress can set spikes that will hurt Tar on switch in, and it could have HP Bug, Earthquake, or Counter to hit certain Tyranitar sets for a lot of damage. Gengar can threaten to burn the Tyranitar or chip it heavily with Giga Drain or HP Grass. Zapdos can paralyze it with Thunder Wave, or get a Toxic off, or get Heavy Chip with Thunderbolt. Snorlax might be able to chip it with the combination of a fighting move and Curse, or just Earthquake, or just any of those in general. And anytime that Tar kills a Mon, or one of our Mons booms, that being Fortress or Gengar, we can go to Dugtrio pretty freely to get the revenge kill, unless Tyranitar has +2 speed. So, I keep this pretty general. I'm not specifying exactly what the sets are, because we can kind of cater them towards certain matchups, like if we want these Pokemon to be particularly good at hitting Tyranitar when it comes in. But everything on this team has some form of options or counterplay. Zapdos, Snorlax, Gengar, maybe not as good, but Breloom plus Dugtrio is very, very solid into Tyranitar. So I would say that this team is pretty good at beating Tyranitar, the Pokemon. But I'm going to contend that this is not generally good against Tyranitar teams because of the sand element. We're going to sort of think about this one. I'm not going to play with this because it's just going to be terrible. But despite having an easy time eliminating Tyranitar, Sandstorm is going to remain on the field. So we have 2 sand immune Pokemon, Fortress and Dugtrio. Of course, they don't really care about the Sandstorm, but our Breloom's not going to get chip healing during the free turns that it generates with Spore, and it's not really going to be able to run like a substitute set. Now, granted, the substitute Breloom set is not quite as good as the standard 3 attacks one, in my opinion, but it does give us a little bit of restriction on what we can do with the Mon, because we're going to have such a short leash on life with Sand up. Maybe if you have Leech Seed, that could help, but I don't know. At that point, just use Celebi. Gengar cannot shrug off weak hits on pivot since it's not getting any chip healing. Gengar can come in a lot of times on a Hidden Power Grass, or a, say, uninvested coverage move from something, or an Ice Beam from Blissey, for example. All these things, Gengar, if it's getting the chip healing and forcing the opponent to switch, it's gonna get a lot of that HP back. But because the sand is up, Gengar's not getting that chip healing. It's gonna die to a couple weak hits, or a weak hit into a stronger hit. So that's not very good for us. Zapdos is forced to rest early if we have a rest Zapdos, or it's just more likely to get 2 or 3 hit KO'd by moves because it's not getting that chip healing. And Snorlax is forced into early rests and can't find easy turns to set up in the face of Mons who are threatening to 4-hit KO. We're going to have to rest loop, and eventually, if our Snorlax gets critically hit, we're just going to lose our Lax, which is really not good. Part of the reason why a Mon like Snorlax is said to be particularly sand weak. But let's talk about Pokemon a little bit more generally and their archetypal matchups into sand. So first, there are sand immune Pokemon. All the rock, ground, and steel types do not mind sand because they just don't take damage from it. Defensive sand immune Pokemon enjoy making progress on passive opponents because they can chip heal while their opponents do not. Take, for example, Swampert, Monopert with Surf, Protect, Toxic and Refresh. You can get your Toxic off on your opponent, refresh off any status that they would be doing to you, and if they're not a Sand Immune Pokemon, they're getting chipped slowly, while Swampert is just going to eat, and it can keep milling Protects to get more chip healing, so it's very sustainable in that kind of matchup. Whereas our offensive Sand Immune would love undoing Leftovers progress on bulkier Pokemon to make it easier to hit KO thresholds. And that goes hand in hand with Spikes, which will get some Pokemon into range for your physical Pokemon. Take, for example, like a Metagross. There might be a Pokemon that is EV to live a Meteor Mash. Then you get a Spike down. They take that Spike's damage, and they're not healing it off anymore because of Sand. Well, now Metagross is threatening to just whoop them with a Meteor Mash, and that's quite good. Next are going to be our offensive Pokemon, the non-Sand Immune ones. Glass Cannons, or Pokemon that have a lot of attack power and not very much longevity, as in low defenses, no access to recovery moves, etc. They can stomach the sand damage because they're going to die in 1 or 2 hits anyway. So you just want to get some big damage off with them, and then if they die, then they die. Hopefully your team can continue to progress to the end game without those Pokemon. Mons that have recovery are forced to spend more turns recovering due to not getting their Leftovers chip healing. This is true for your offensive Pokemon as well. Take, for example, like a Celebi with Leech Seed. You're going to have to get a lot of Leech Seeds off to try to keep your HP up because you're not getting that chip healing anymore. Mons with no recovery have their setup potential hard capped, meaning that you can't just keep clicking your Swords Dance or your Agility to boost all the way up to try to win a game really quickly. When you are not getting Leftovers recovery and you're going to be chipped down and eventually die. A great example of a Pokemon that has issues with that sometimes is Salamence. Say you need like 2 DDs to kill, say, a Blissey that's in the back. Well, if you get hit with a move and that does about 50%, and the sand keeps you from getting your self out of the KO threshold, then that could be a real problem for you. Pinch Berry Sweepers, which would be like your Lychee Berry, your Salac Berry, etc., are going to have a difficult time activating their Pinch Berry without dying to sand damage. In particular, the Endure Pokemon. They endure down to 1 HP, and then they're going to take the Sandstorm chip and die on that turn. So that's kind of just a hard counter to that strategy in and of itself. Defensive Pokemon have some slightly different problems. If they have recovery, they are going to have to use a lot of turns recovering rather than making other progress. That might not be too bad, especially if you're weathering the Sandstorm more effectively than your opponent is. So say, for example, you have Blissey and your opponent has something like, I don't know, Suicune. Blissey, because it's got that more immediate recovery, is going to be able to do a little bit more on the turns that it's not recovering, whereas Suicune is having to think about itself on a timer until it has to click rest. Now, granted, Suicune generally wins that matchup, but you can at least force that rest. Then if you have a switch in for Suicune, then the Blissey's not too bothered by that, for example. If the mod does not have recovery, well, then their defensive utility is hard capped. I think about some of walls, like, say, Moltres, for example. It's not necessarily a ultra defensive Pokemon per se, but it is a Pokemon that does get a lot out of its defensive utility, or even like Gengar, for example. These Pokemon they don't have access to easy recovery moves. Rest is about all you get, and they're not really like self-sufficient enough with rest to reliably run it. I know I've seen Moltres run it before, but usually it's with aromatherapy support. So yeah, in any case, these Pokemon are not going to be able to wall forever if sand is up, especially if they don't have a healing move. For both offense and defense, you're going to lose momentum to spend turn recovering, or you're going to lose an entire Pokemon as chip piles up. It's basically stealing turns away from you, so that you're having to get more out of your Pokemon early, which is honestly fine for some teams and some playstyles. If you can beat your opponent pretty early on in the game, then the infinite sand is probably not going to be that consequential to you. But when games get stalled out, that's when sand is really, really important to have sort of a long-term game plan for. So let's take a look at this team again and see, does this have a long-term game plan versus sand? The defensive pivots and walls, if they take sand chip without reliable recovery, then the defensive core is shaky. So say, for example, Gengar, Zapdos, Snorlax, those are kind of the defensive pieces of the team. Kind of depends on their sets a little bit, but I would imagine that those are the ones that are going to offer the best defensive utility. Fortress a little bit as well. But yeah, 3 out of 4 of those Pokemon are taking sand chip, meaning that they're going to have to be careful about what moves they're taking, and they're going to have to click rest very commonly, and that's going to slow down the pace of this team, which for this team, I don't think you want to play a very long-term game. It's like Breloom and Dugtrio are not exactly long-term Pokemon. If the offensive Pokemon take sand chip, then they have to play more conservatively. They can't switch into certain risky hits that might put them into like a 2-hit KO range. If they didn't have sand up, you maybe could get in on a hit that does like 55%, but if you're forcing your opponent to switch out, you're getting extra chip healing from your leftovers, and that gives you another turn to maybe do something risky with your offensive piece. Otherwise, you're just gonna have to like suck it up. So like Breloom, for example, is a pretty frail Pokemon, and even resisted hits like a Thunderbolt from an opposing Zapdos are gonna do a pretty hefty chunk, and you can't come in on so many of those if you're taking that sand chip throughout the game. You might only be able to do it once. And if you need to get a Spore off on Zapdos, or if you need to threaten it, maybe you have HP Rock or something, that could be a problem for you. Similarly with Snorlax as a sort of win condition, if the sand is up, well then special attackers who are in the 3 or 4 hit KO range on Snorlax are going to have a lot better odds to beat the Snorlax in the endgame than if they did not. Even physical attackers, if they're forcing the Snorlax to rest and you're giving them 2 turns to attack, that's 2 turns they could get a critical hit on you. And if they get a critical hit, they might just be able to beat your Snorlax just apropos of nothing. This is why all in on Snorlax teams really, really want Weather Clear, so that there's no sand, so that if they do get crit, then they might still be able to live with their Snorlax. So, just sort of a more concrete hypothetical, think about what this team would look like if it was up against a timid Zapdos with sand up. Breloom is now getting like 2-hit KO'd, so it can't really come in on Zapdos reliably like that. Fortress, I mean, is already not fantastic versus Zapdos. The sand doesn't make it any better, or any worse, I should say, but it's not making it better, right? Gengar, similar to Breloom, not getting that chip healing means that it's probably getting 2-hit KO'd by a lot of Zapdos, unless you have a very Spadef invested Gengar, which is possible. Your own Zapdos is also in that 2-hit KO range. Snorlax, if it can be forced to rest loop, then Zapdos just has to play for a critical hit, and that should take care of it. And then Dugtrio is not very good at eliminating Zapdos. So, like, that combination, Zapdos plus Sand, is really, really dangerous to this team. So, we might have to reconsider with this team because we're so bad into Sandstorm. Some things that we maybe could try are a wind condition that is a little bit more resilient to Sandstorm. So instead of Snorlax, if we did, I don't know, Registeel, I guess, if you want something that's very similar to Snorlax's role, that could be something. Although I do think that this team just has some other fundamental issues, like versus the Pokemon Gengar, that we're probably going to need to do a little bit more than just switching one or two pieces out. But Sand is a very big reason why this team is struggling. So how do we counterplay against Sand if we're going to build our own team from scratch and we want it to be solid from the jump? We could stack more Sand immune Pokemon on the team. The more Sand immunities you have, then the less you are going to care about Sand in general. But you want to also make sure that they're covering certain roles for you, of course. You can't just have Quagsire and say, oh, my team's good against Sand because Quagsire doesn't get hit by Sandstorm. You may want to consider the roles a little bit. So if you needed Snorlax, say, to kill special walls for you, well, maybe you want to try Metagross instead. That's going to give you a little bit more longevity and also just a more potent attacker into those special walls, which is why Metagross is such a great Pokemon. Weather Clear, if a team has an easy time eliminating Tyranitar, which usually comes down to having Dugtrio trap and eliminate it, you could also pressure it in other ways, like with spikes, having super effective fighting type coverage, especially on Pokemon that lure Tyranitar in, say, like, for example, Salamence. Although I don't know if Tyranitar wants to come in on Salamence all the time, but having a strong Brick Break for the Tyranitar is definitely going to help you in the matchup. And then you are going to click the move Sunny Day or Rain Dance to override the Sandstorm. I mean, technically you could click Hail as well, but Hail is a little bit less immediate in removing that chip damage from most of your Pokemon, so I wouldn't recommend it. It's possible though. Did you know that Hail doesn't even give you an accuracy boost on Blizzard in Generation 3? Such a crap weather. And then we can have more reliable recovery. So Pokemon with Recover and Soft Boiled will keep healthy as long as they have PP. So if you're confident that you can play a matchup and not have to use up the entirety of your Recover or Soft Boiled move pool, then you may still be able to weather the storm even if you have some Sand weak Pokemon that does not have weather clearing support with it. So for example, like your Celebes, your Starmie, your Blissey, all these Pokemon can keep themselves healthy for a long time. Not indefinitely though, so you definitely need some amount of progress making. Usually Spikes goes a long way with that, but yeah, there you go. Rule 2 is going to be our matchup versus Skarmory. More specifically, how many turns are we giving Skarmory to do what it needs to do? And that's really important because Skarmory has access to the most centralizing move in the format, which is Spikes. So I'm sure you're all familiar with Spikes at this point, but if you're not, I'm going to go over it pretty briefly. Spikes will deal 12.5% damage to all grounded Pokemon, which is Pokemon who are not immune to ground-type moves, i.e. non-flying types, non-levitators. Spikes can be stacked. If you get 2 layers up, you're dealing 16.7% damage. And if you get 3 layers up, you're dealing 25% damage, which is a lot. Spikes can be removed from the field with a successful rapid spin, but of course there are some caveats to that, which we will explain a little bit later. And later is now. How do we deal with spikes? So there are a few ideas that work for handling Skarmory and thus handling the spikes. We could use the Pokemon Magneton. It has the ability Magnet Pull. It traps Skarmory and will limit it to 1 or 2 layers of spikes. So this team right here is Blue Offense. You probably should be familiar with it. If you're not, then I recommend that you check out the sample teams, or even check out my part 0, where I explain to you why you should be checking out the sample teams. But this team does not have a super duper great Skarm matchup otherwise, but if you can get the Magneton in and eliminate Skarmory, well, now you've unlocked some of your pieces. Heracross can start boosting. It doesn't have to worry about getting drill pecked. Metagross doesn't need hacks to go in its favor to beat down Skarmory before it gets all its spikes and roars it away. Snorlax is really, really tough at taking on Skarmory. It has some tools, and some sets can do things to Skarmory better than others, but for this team, Snorlax wants to be unlocked, does not want to have to deal with the combination of a steel type that is immune to Earthquake. So, yeah. And also, there's just a lot of grounded Pokemon on this team. You don't want to be taking Spike's chip every time that you switch. And if you are going to take it, then at least only take 1 layer of it. The other idea is beatdown plus rapid spin, and I say beatdown plus rapid spin because spin on its own is not always sufficient. Take this team, for example, with Claydol. If you don't have partners with Claydol that have the means to threaten the Skarmory and kill it, then what's going to happen is Skarmory's going to come in on the Claydol, get a Toxic off, start chipping it with Drill Peck, and if the Claydol's low, you're going to be forced to have to boom or just lose your Claydol, and if you've lost the Claydol, well, then spikes are going back up. So it doesn't really help you just to have a spinner. You have to have a team that threatens Skarmory. Now, some of these Pokemon obviously do a pretty good amount of damage to Skarmory, like Suicune has really strong Hydro Pumps that are threatening to 3-hit KO Skarmory. Salamence with its Fire Blast should do a solid amount, probably 2-hit KO the Skarmory. Tyranitar, if you can get a Dragon Dance and get your Rock Slide off, you're doing about 50%, and you have the flinch chance, so that can really limit Skarmory's turns. You might look at Metagross and Snorlax and say, well, those two Pokemon don't have great moves to hit Skarmory, but, I mean, when you put a Choice Band on Metagross, that Meteor Mash gets really threatening. You can, at the very least, kill a Skarmory that's trying to get 3 layers on you, and you could do even better if the Hacks is in your side, if you're getting the attack raises, if you're getting a critical hit. Snorlax has the move Focus Punch on this team, which punishes Skarmory for going for the spikes. You'll be doing about 1/3 of its health. And then every turn that the Skarmory goes for something like Drill Peck or Protect is a turn that it's not getting its spikes up. So that's kind of nice. Although, keep in mind that it is also getting recovery for predicting your Focus Punch, so you don't want to let it get too many turns right there. But this is kind of a solid structure for handling Skarmory, even though you don't have something as immediately pressuring to it like a Magneton. If you allow the Skarmory to get 2 or 3 layers, it's usually not that big a deal because you can get your Claydol in and spin them away. Now granted, keep in mind that you're going to have to play pretty well around Gengar. You could do some things to help yourself out with that, like for example, if you wanted to run a Pursuit Tyranitar, although granted, I think it feels bad to have to run Pursuit with a Claydol, but that's one thing you could do. If you wanted to include a second spinner on the team, like Fortress, that could give you a little bit more longevity versus and consistency versus Spike's teams. But that's all kind of just up to you, what you want the tools for your particular beatdown team to be. And then the third thing is Superman. This is, I think it was originally just a team, but it's kind of evolved into an archetype where you're using Pokemon that for the most part do not get hit with spikes, and also Pokemon that don't really care about Skarmory's Toxic or Roar that much, or at the very least that you have counterplay to Toxic and Roar that you can explore with the team. So this team here is Misdreavus Superman. 5 of the 6 Pokemon on the team do not get hit by Spikes damage at all. The one that does is Blissey, but Blissey has really good longevity even in the face of Spikes because of Soft Boiled and having ridiculously high HP and special defense. Not to say that Blissey will just live forever against Spikes, but it's not the worst Pokemon in the world at surviving while 3 layers of Spikes are down. We don't really care too much about Toxic because we have Heal Bell on Blissey with this team. So that's going to help us to mitigate some of that. We also, I think, are running Rest on Zapdos at the very least. Maybe also on Moltres. To be honest, I don't play with this team very much, so I don't have everything off the top of my head memorized. So it is what it is. But it's kind of fine that we have some Pokemon on this team, like our own Skarmory, like sometimes our Blissey if we're not able to get some status on their Skarmory, like Flygon, who don't really hit opposing Skarmory very hard, because they're not going to be able to get that much value out of the turn. Maybe a Toxic on something, force it to have to rest, or force Blissey to have to come in later, but as long as we beat the Skarm eventually, then we're probably fine with this team. And if it gets a spike up on us, then oh well, whatever. How not to deal with Skarmory or spikes, because this is really important. I see a lot of newer players saying, oh, my team's not bad into Skarmory because of this, and I'm trying to drive this point into your head that this is not sufficient means for dealing with Skarmory. And this is a team that I built and featured on my channel. It's from my Blaziken video with the lead Blaziken. At the time that I made this video, I was like, well, I mean, I've got Blaziken, I've got Suicune, I've got Raikou, I've got Porygon 2. That's a lot of things that hit Skarmory, and I just switched to them, force that Skarmory to have to switch out, and then it's not getting spikes up on me. But like, that's not sufficient, because if Skarmory can find an entry point and I have to spend a turn switching, then that's a turn that it is getting a spike down on the field. So Blaziken and Raikou, of course, can KO the Skarmory, right? And you could think of those as dealing with Skarmory, but it's not great because Skarmory is not going to stay in versus them. And there are usually some pretty good switch-ins to both of these Pokemon. Blaziken, for example, does not deal very well with bulky waters like Milotic and Suicune. Raikou, on the other hand, does not deal very well with certain special walls, particularly Blissey, especially if it has Seismic Toss, but even Snorlax or Celebi can be a problem for it. And if Skarmory has any of those partners, which frankly it does a lot, so a lot of the time I should say, you're not going to be able to force as much progress as you would think by going for those switches. Skarmory has a relatively free entry on Metagross and Flygon, who do not have sets that are very well capable of handling the Skarmory. So anytime these Pokemon are in, Skarmory can switch in and start stacking the spikes, which means that a lot of time what our counterplay has to be is when we get something like our Flygon or our Metagross in, we have to switch to our Pokemon that handle Skarmory. And like I said, if their team is well kitted to switch into Blaziken or Raikou, then like we're not making much progress. We're going to run out of moves. We may get caught with a, say, like a Drill Peck on our Blaziken switch, which is not good, or a Toxic on our Raikou. And we're then on a timer because we're having to play very predictably to stop Skarmory from stacking up all the layers. We have 5 out of 6 Pokemon on this team that are hit by spikes, so we're not going to be able to just eat the spikes into the end game because Flygon, as much as I think it's a pretty good Pokemon, it's not going to be able to 1v6 a lot of teams, probably any team, but yeah. So some changes we could make to this team to make it a little bit more resilient against Skarmory is we could switch out our Rock Resist with Claydol. Claydol is very defensively similar to Flygon. It's not completely one-to-one, but having the ground immunity, having the rock resistance, both of those things go hand in hand pretty well. The reason why we want Claydol is to spin away the hazards, because we're not going to be able to stop Skarmory from getting one spike if it happens to get in on a Pokemon that is not named Blaziken or Raikou that threaten to one-shot it. So that means that we are going to need to handle at least one spike, even if we manage to kill the Skarmory. So I do think that spin support on this team is very helpful, but that doesn't really address the issue with Metagross as being a Pokemon that allows Skarmory to kind of just sit in and chip heal and lay down spikes and start roaring us around and being annoying. So we may also want to look at switching our Metagross set to a Choice Banded one so that we're punishing Skarmory a lot more. One of the things that's really nice about Choice Banded Metagross that we don't always talk about when it comes to beating Skarmory is that when we get this damage on the Skarmory, eventually the Skarmory has to switch, right? Like, it's not going to be able to get up a bunch of layers and roar us away indefinitely. It's after like 2 or 3 hits, it's feeling the pressure. But that means that your opponent will have to switch into a Choice Banded Metagross clicking Meteor Mash, which is really, really difficult for a lot of teams to do. Skarmory might be one of the only steel resist on the team. They may have another bulky water like, say, Swampert or Suicune or Milotic, of course, but those Pokemon are running into the same sort of issue where they're going to be chipped and take a lot of damage, and if we get attack raises and critical hits, then we might just bust through their team with Metagross, and there's not much that they can do about it. But at the very least, if we can get them to switch to their bulky waters, then we can maybe try to pressure them with our Raikou or our Suicune to sort of win the game. And these are 2 Pokemon that are not going to let Skarmory in too effectively. So this team here probably is a little bit better into Skarmory. Not to say like perfect, but it's got the sort of beatdown angle that we're looking for, without having to change too much of what the initial concept or the first draft of this team was. So it's always nice when that works out that way. Do the other spikers matter? Because Skarmory's not the only Pokemon that gets spikes on the field. It is important to consider your other spikers in the tier, like for example Fortress. Sometimes you'll see Cloyster, sometimes you'll see Glalie, and then shout out to everybody in Revival tournaments who's been losing with Roselia, because that is another Pokemon that gets spikes, but it's not great. I mean, it has its use cases, but I'm not completely sold on it. All of these Pokemon are definitely around and will get the spikes up, but they have a combination of things like being spikes weak themselves, being pretty frail, like particularly Cloyster on its special defense side, or I mean kind of just Roselia period. It's not taking too many neutral hits, probably just 1 or 2. They're weaker than Skarmory is to common coverage moves, in particular Fire. All of these Pokemon are weak to Fire, well, kind of except for Cloyster, but because Cloyster's special defense is so low, it might as well be. And then they're just like losing to Gengar as well. Now, granted, Skarmory doesn't have a great Gengar matchup either, but because it's not Spikes week, it's able to switch out and switch back in and not take chip damage against a Skarmgar team or just any Gengar Spikes. The main idea that I'm trying to illustrate here is that Skarmory is self-sufficient enough to threaten 3 layers with some level of consistency. If you don't have Magneton, and your opponent plays well with their Skarmory, it's not uncommon they're going to be able to get all 3 layers up if they want them. Now, some teams are going to be paced in such a way that they actually want to preserve Skarmory health. It's not worth trading too much to get all the way to 3 layers. They just want to get 1. Makes sense, but that being said, Skarmory oftentimes is going to be able to position itself to get many turns to do something. And that's why Skarmory in particular is the one that we're focusing on and not just Spikes. You're also going to have just natural checks for a lot of the other Spikers through building your team in a way that kind of makes sense. Like, for example, if you have Charizard on your team, well, you have a pretty good switch in for almost all of these Pokemon, and there's not going to be too many Pokemon that want to switch into Charizard. I mean, Milotic is a great one, but if you're getting Spikes down, you have your Hidden Power Grass, or maybe you're crazy and you have T-Punch, you can eventually break through that Milotic, and now it's like, oh man, this Charizard's kind of farming me. I mean, again, things like that kind of work against Skarmory teams as well, but if you're not getting your own Spikes up, then the Skarmory's, like, you're not making that much progress by forcing a Skarmory to switch out. You make a little bit, but I digress. Rule 3 is going to be the matchup versus Blissey. So Blissey is not the only special wall in the tier, but is the only one that has this combination of traits, which I know sounds very specific, but this combination of traits makes Blissey very dangerous, and it has nothing even really to do with its stats. Access to immediate recovery in soft boiled. Pokemon like Registeel don't really have that. You have the means to remove status via Natural Cure or Aromatherapy or Heal Bell. Again, a Pokemon like Registeel, Regice, don't really have that. They have to click Rest, which drains a lot of momentum. Blissey has a way to boost its special defense, which is going to help it versus Calm Mind teams via its own Calm Mind, which other potential special walls may not be able to accomplish. They may be actually pretty bad into Calm Mind span teams. And then you're not weak to any special attacks, and also you're not 4 times weak to anything. So I think about it as an example, Celebi, which handles 3 of these 4 things. Celebi is actually a pretty good special wall. It's got a lot of recovery options, namely Recover, which has double the PP, and Leech Seed. You could also even run Giga Drain if you want. I don't know if I would run all 3 of those on one set, but I mean, it's a free country. You can do whatever you want. Well, I mean, if you live in a free country, that is. Shout outs to all of you who do not, and I feel for you. And I don't know, let me know if I can do anything. I'm just one guy though, but let's not get too derailed. The fact that Celebi is a grass type though, in particular, kind of hampers its ability to be a special world beater. Being hit by super effective fire and ice type moves is not fantastic, and then the ×4 weakness to bug makes it particularly difficult to handle. So, for example, a Tyranitar with HP Bug or Dugtrio with HP Bug is threatening to do a lot to the Celebi, whereas Blissey, I mean, while its defense is not really that great, I didn't know that I could do that. I've been using a clicker, and I didn't know I could turn off my thing. Sorry, I'm getting distracted. The ADHD is getting to me. The thing about Blissey, though, is while it has really low defense, it has enough that it is pretty commonly going to be able to dodge some 2-hit KOs. And if Blissey is able to do something like get a Toxic or a Thunder Wave off on you, or an Ice Beam or whatever, and then soft-boiled loop back up, then like you don't even really quite beat it. There are some Pokemon that will run fighting coverage to handle Blissey, and something like a Brick Break from Tyranitar, yeah, that can do a lot, but you also have to be like attack invested. Take for example Mixed Salamence. That is a Pokemon that you would think would be able to do really nicely against Blissey because it's got the natural 135 attack stat and access to Brick Break, but if you're not investing in the attack, then you don't even usually 2-hit KO Blissey, which is kind of diabolical. Crazy how the damage formula works out like that. Some Pokemon or some teams can wear down Blissey by stacking hazards on the field, in particular, well, spikes obviously in ADV. But if Blissey's the last Pokemon on the field, like they have done a good job preserving their Blissey, keeping it healthy, and then you kill their second to last Pokemon, Blissey's the last thing. Well, it's gonna take that however many layers of spikes damage, but it's not getting chipped from there. And if it's something like a Calm Mind Blissey, and you don't have something that can just beat down the Blissey right then and there, you're gonna be in a lot of trouble. That Blissey might be able to like basically last mon Suicune you, where it boosts up, you can't kill it, you get recovered on, and then it just beats your team down. So that's why in particular I'm interested in how you beat a last mon Blissey. Thankfully, it's not too difficult to slot a Pokemon that beats a Lastmon Blissey onto a team. You can have a Pokemon with really high attack stat. So, for example, Tyranitar, Metagross, Machamp, Heracross. There are plenty of other examples, but these Pokemon are well attack invested enough that if you have a physical variant of them, you're usually going to be able to 2-hit KO Blissey, and even if you're not quite getting the 2-hit KO, you are going to force it to have to use up a lot of its soft boileds, and if it runs out of soft boileds, well, Blissey's usually not that hard to beat anymore. So these Pokemon in particular do a good job. I want to give special mention to our buddy Machamp here. If you're running an Adamant Nature and Cross Chop, you don't even need an attack boost or a Choice Banded boost to one-shot kill Bold Blissey, which is really nice. But credit to Bold Blissey, if the Machamp doesn't have literally maximum investment, even if it has a 30 in its attack IV, then it does have a role to live that, which is insane. But, I mean, it's Blissey, so who's surprised? I talked a little bit about Salamence before, but Salamence is kind of a question mark here. Yes, it has a really high attack stat. Yes, if you invest in it all the way, it's basically hitting as hard as Metagross. Just ignore the fact that Metagross has a better, more spammable stab move. But Salamence has a very key problem, and that is being 4 times weak to ice. Blissey is oftentimes threatening to one-shot kill Salamence. Now, some Salamence sets can run enough bulk to survive an Ice Beam from Blissey, but that cuts a lot into either your speed or your attack, or sometimes both, in order to do that. So it's not always worth it. And even Brick Break, if you get +1, you don't usually even kill Blissey, so you're giving Blissey an opportunity to switch in on your Dragon Dance, and your Brick Break probably doesn't even kill, and you probably die to Ice Beam. All these things just are really bad for you. Thunder Wave is also a big problem for Salamence. Now, it's a problem for the other Pokemon as well, but Tyranitar and Metagross can pretty justifiably run Lumberries because they're not getting chipped out by Sandstorm, and the fighters that we have on the screen have the ability Guts, so it might actually be to their benefit to get paralyzed in some cases. So all of that to say, Salamence is not the go-to Blissey answer for most teams. A similar thing could be said for Gyarados. Now, Gyarados is sometimes able to get away with it because Blissey is more commonly going to drop Thunderbolt than it is Ice Beam. That being because Seismic Toss plus Ice Beam is pretty good at hitting a lot of things, whereas if you dropped Ice Beam for Thunderbolt on that, you're going to have some more blind spots, particularly against like the strong ground types like Swampert. But, I mean, granted, Swampert's not taking too much from Ice Beam, but you have that freeze chance, which is nice. And, you know, Pokemon like Flygon and Salamence, who are hit ×4 super effective for Ice Beam, really entice you to want to use Ice Beam. Where, you know, there's only really Gyarados for Thunderbolt. Pokemon with the move Explosion can be really nice at dealing with Lastmon Blissey. It's also just not bad at dealing with Blissey in the mid-game. Take, for example, Snorlax, which is a Pokemon that has a pretty high attack stat. Doesn't have to boom on Blissey to beat it, but having the immediate option can be nice if you're in a situation where, say, Blissey's going to kill you in 2 hits. Then, and you're not going to kill it in 2 hits, so you need that panic button. So, like, that's something that Snorlax can do. Claydol also has Explosion and does enough damage to usually kill Blissey. It kind of depends on your attack investment, but you don't need even max attack investment to get there. These other 2 Pokemon, Fortress, yes, has even more attack than Claydol. Now, it doesn't commonly get the opportunity to invest in its attack because it needs a lot of defensive investment, particularly special defense, if it wants to not completely get smashed by Hidden Power Fire Magneton. But yeah, it threatens to do a lot to Blissey. And then Gengar, not so much because it has a much lower attack stat, but it does do enough that you could chain into a Pokemon that can kill the Blissey from there. And Dugtrio is a fantastic option. There are a lot of special offense teams where the goal is to get an explosion on Blissey, and if you don't kill it with that explosion, you're going to go to Dugtrio, outspeed and kill the Blissey, and Blissey obviously cannot switch out when Dugtrio is on the field because of Arena Trap. Now, that being said, keep in mind that Explosion costs your entire Pokemon to do that. So what I'm saying here is one of the consistent ways to handle Blissey, and in particular like a Lastmon Blissey, is to have a slot dedicated to killing itself. So that might not be an option that you can afford to do. Say if you get down to your Lastmon and it's an Explosion Mon, well, best you can do then is tie if you're up against a Blissey. In particular, if you have one of these Pokemon that is not threatening to just beat down the Blissey one-on-one like Claydol. So, without using Explosion. So, yeah. A third thing you could have is Toxic or Burn, and there are plenty of Pokemon that get Toxic, but I'm going to highlight Skarmory and Zapdos as being pretty good for that because they very commonly like to run Toxic. But Will-O-Wisp can also help you get there. It's going to be a little bit slower, especially if it's a Lastmon Blissey, but you could be in a situation where you have something like your Weezing, which also gets Boom, by the way, or your Moltres, hit a Will-O-Wisp on the Blissey, and then you can go into a Pokemon like Suicune and just rest loop the Blissey. In particular, if the Blissey does not have Calm Mind to try to reverse sweep you. But at the very least, you're putting it on a timer. It's going to run out of soft boils eventually, and then you're going to be able to just allow that Will-O-Wisp to chip down the Blissey, and you're going to have a very, very slow endgame. But that is something you could do. I guess another sort of option here, if you're up against particularly a Blissey that does not have Calm Mind and a way to chip out through your team, is you could just PP stall it. Now, I mean, I don't know if I love that as a just sort of general game plan for how to deal with Blissey, but it's an option. And if you have a lot of Pokemon with Wish, Recover, Rest, you could go for it. But yeah. Teams that can beat Blissey often have tools to beat the other special walls as well. So say, for example, if one of your dominant strategies for dealing with Blissey is going to be Gengar explodes into Dugtrio traps it, well, that's going to work for Celebi as well. That's going to work for Jirachi as well. So it's a pretty resilient strategy. Don't mind it one bit. But yeah. And then also, like, things like Metagross do a lot of damage to all the special walls. If you're clicking the right move, like an Earthquake on Jirachi or a Meteor Mash on Celebi, you should be doing like 2-hit KO worthy damage most of the time. Now, some of these strategies, again, not so great into them. Like, for example, if you're looking to Toxic Last Mon special wall and that special wall happens to be Jirachi, well, yeah, you're not going to be able to use that as a method, so keep that in mind. If you want more immediate pressure on Blissey, this is something that I've kind of been talking about before, so I'm going to speed through it a little bit, is if you have a team that leans heavily on special attackers and or just Pokemon that are not going to be able to 1v1 Blissey, usually, you're probably not going to be able to make much progress in the early game versus Blissey. With this 5 here, Blissey can come in on almost any of them and just kind of sit and do what it wants. Get a Thunder Wave on Jirachi, get Ice Beam damage racking up on Claydol or Gengar. Seismic Toss this Suicune, force it to rest, then get a switch out to roar it away. All of these things are not super duper nice. But we do have some options. We could use Claydol and Gengar to boom, but Blissey might just recover off damage later in a game, especially if it's sandless, particularly against Gengar. Gengar's only going to be doing about 70% with the boom. Still a lot of damage, but if you're not able to follow up and kill the Blissey, then like it gets back in on something like a Suicune and click soft boiled, and now it's back up to like 80%. So yeah, you don't really have a lot of wiggle room there. Claydol, of course, could threaten to kill off the Blissey, but Blissey might just switch to avoid the boom, especially against Claydol, and especially if you've revealed these 5 Pokemon your opponent knows, like, then you're kind of in trouble. But that's where Dugtrio comes in. As I've kind of explained before, it can trap the Blissey and start hitting it with Earthquakes. You could also use the move Beat Up, but this particular team, Beat Up is not great because you have a lot of low attack Pokemon like Jinx and Gengar. Claydol is not very high either. Suicune also not very high. I think Beat Up with this team on average is doing about 52%, which is just not quite enough to consistently get the 2-hit KO on Blissey, especially in a sandless game, and we're not bringing our own sand, so like we kind of need our opponent to help us out there if that's our strategy. And we also don't have spikes to get easy chip damage on the Blissey either, so what we're gonna have to do is set up the Dugtrio with a Gengar boom to allow Dugtrio to secure that KO. It's not technically an OHKO, but it's the first attack that Dugtrio is going to go for, and it's going to kill the Blissey so that we don't have to take an Ice Beam on follow-up. So that's sort of the idea with this sort of team here, and if you manage to get that, then your opponent probably doesn't have a great special wall, and you can win the game via your Suicune and your Jirachi from there. Now I'm going to show you a replay that sort of demonstrates what happens if you have a team that does not have like the proper tools for beating a Blissey. This is a game that I played on ladder. I have the Blissey, so obviously it's going to go pretty well for me, but let's just see what happens. Okay, we're playing against some random gamer on the ladder here. We're going to be looking at this game from their perspective to sort of see what happens when it looks like your team can't really handle a Blissey. So they have lead Salamence, and we have lead Skarmory. Usually, when I have a lead Skarmory team, I'm more likely gonna just click spikes turn one. If you're not willing to click spikes with lead Skarmory, then I would maybe suggest that you don't lead it, or you have to have some kind of cool opening that otherwise helps you. Notice I switched to Flygon there and am able to get a Toxic off on the spinner. Now Claydol is going to be on a timer, not going to be able to spin forever, so Skarmory is going to be able to set up spikes, which can pressure some of the things on this team that might be able to handle Blissey. We'll see. But we also saw a Kingdra there, which is definitely not going to be able to get through Blissey. And now we see a Raikou, another Pokemon that's not going to be able to get through Blissey. Now, fortunately for my opponent, I actually have no Seismic Toss on my Blissey, so it's not going to be that robust at handling Raikou. But Raikou's not going to be able to just break through and win. It's going to need to be able to get a bunch of Calm Minds off to break through the Blissey. Now, that was kind of a swag play there to go for Roar on the Raikou. I don't know if I would generally recommend that. This team definitely has some Raikou switch-ins, but it gets in the opponent's head, I guess, a little bit. So pat myself on the back for getting that right, although I would say it was risky and probably not necessary. But we managed to see a Gyarados here, switch to Zapdos, which should force this Gyarados out. Don't really have to predict too much because this Claydol's not getting its HP back. Zapdos is going to get a hidden power off, which is going to put this Claydol really low. It's only got but so many more turns that it can handle. That Zapdos has Baton Pass, so we don't even have to waste any amount of turns going for like a pivot to, say, Skarmory, then pivot to Blissey. And then they reveal Lastmon Shedinja. So now let's pause here and sort of think it through what this team can do to handle Blissey. So we have Explosion on Claydol, but Claydol is very low, and there's just no way that I'm going to let my opponent have a boom on Blissey for free. We have Salamence, but as I mentioned before, Salamence is going to be taking 4x damage from Ice Beam, so this Blissey might just kill it, and you don't have a way to one-shot kill the Blissey back. Even if you have Dragon Dance plus Brick Break, you'll be doing, say upwards of 75% to the Blissey, but even a 25% health Blissey can pivot around, get some HP back, and then if it gets a soft-boiled off on something like your Kingdra, then you're kind of screwed. And this team doesn't have spikes or sand to make that damage really stick, so Salamence is not really an answer. Gyarados is probably your best bet at beating Blissey, in particular if the Blissey does not have Thunderbolt, but one of Blissey's most common partners is Skarmory, and if you're not able to eliminate the Skarmory, then Gyarados is not going to be able to make very much progress. Now, there is one more physical attacker on this team, which is Shedinja, but Shedinja is not going to be able to beat any Toxic variant of Blissey, as we see I do have, and it's also just like a very difficult Pokemon to really make work in general. This team, I will tell you, I do not have Tyranitar on it, so I'm not going to be able to just get the free kill on Shedinja with Sand, but I do have Spikes, and if this team is like as all in on Shedinja as it kind of looks, it's not completely. There are plenty of win conditions, but if your goal is to try to keep this Shedinja alive, then you're going to have to keep bringing this Claydol in to spin away the spikes. Otherwise, like you just have a spike sack, which honestly it might be a good use for Shedinja, but only if you have a Trapper, and well, this team does not have a Trapper, so whoops, that is not what I meant to do. There we go. Gyarados is going to come in on a Toxic, so now Gyarados is on a timer. Skarmory can come in, and yeah, unless you have like Fire Blast or something, you're not really going to be able to break through this Skarmory. Goes for Taunt, which is kind of coping, I'm not going to lie, as Drill Peck is coming down, and yeah, there's not much you can do. Now, I guess a saving grace, in a sense, is that you had a hidden power that was not resisted by Skarm. I'm assuming Rock. I don't know if I like Taunt plus HP Rock that much, but it's just okay. It's an option. Gengar's going to come in, blow up on the Raikou, and set up for the Dug Trap. Now Raikou's dead, and you're kind of in trouble. You're needing to get to the Salamence to sort of break through this Blissey so that you can enable Kingdra to win the game, but we have not dealt enough damage to all the other Pokemon to really force that issue. Now I go for a Drill Peck there. I probably should have just kept spiking until Toxic was going to take out the Claydol, so I could manage to keep the spike up, and then Shedinja is going to be completely useless for the rest of the game. But because this is a physical Mence, I can go to my defensive Flygon, get a Toxic off, and now Mence is on a timer. Go back to Skarmory, who's plenty healthy, and I can get a Roar. Now, I could also opt to get a Protect to get some more chip healing and some more damage on the Salamence. I don't think Skarmory is going to die to a +3 move from Salamence. I mean, yeah, if it gets the flinch, that could be bad, but I don't think Salamence has enough time to get through the rest of the team. In particular, I think because we have a Protect Flygon who can manage, and now Blissey just wins this endgame here. Kingdra's never going to be able to break through the Blissey. It's the best it can do is get a freeze, but then I just switch my Blissey out with Natural Cure, come back in, and then continue to wall the Kingdra. So we don't really need to see much more of this game, and that's it. Yeah, so this team, I mean, this is really the ultimate example of having to balance this big three here. You have to have Weather Clear for your Shedinja to do anything versus Sand. You have to have Spin, and hopefully Pokemon that handle the Skarmory very well so that you can kill it, and then you can make your Spin stick. I will say I don't think this team is that great at doing that. I think maybe you want a mixed Salamence, or at least like DD with Fire Blast to help you out with that. Because Shedinja's never going to be able to beat Skarmory one-on-one. And Gyarados has a lot of issues doing that, which maybe also means that we should switch to Gyarados for something that helps in the Skarm matchup a little bit. I'm not sure. But in having all of that, we're still also a little bit struggling to beat the Blissey, because the only physical attackers that we have are pretty damn threatened by it, or have very easy switch-ins in the case of Gyarados to Skarmory. So, not to like rain on the parade of this battler, I'm sure that their team is very fun and they can do. They could probably win some matchups with it, but I will say that it's pretty much highlighting some of the issues that we see with teams that don't have great answers, in particular to Blissey. A little bit also with Skarmory. Will your team be good if you follow these 3 rules? I kind of laid them out for you, and I've explained the importance of them, and you might just think, oh, if I can handle those 3 things, then I have a good team. Well, I'm not here to say that that's it, right? You maybe will have a good team if you do that, but I will tell you, you certainly won't have a consistently good team if you neglect any of those 3 rules. Sand, Skarmory, and Blissey are 3 of the most common things that exist in this tier, and they require wide team-wide game plans to not immediately lose to them. They also form the pillars of the most dominant archetype in the format, which is TSS. This team right here is Beer Lover. It's very, very indicative of the ADV metagame. And even if it's not specifically Beer Lover that's being used, the combination of Tyranitar, Skarmory, Blissey is on a lot of teams. The presence that they have is immense. You're not going to get away from them. There are some teams that don't have any of those Pokemon, and sure, okay, you probably can beat them if you're neglecting those 3 rules, but you're not going to be able to beat consistent good teams if you're not following those, because these Pokemon, Tyranitar, Skarmory, and Blissey, exist so commonly, even if they're not all together. Other threats such as Zapdos, Rock Slide Spam, Bold Suicune, Curslax, DD Vents, all these win conditions should also be considered in the builder. I'm not saying, like, if you have answers for, or a game plan for the big 3, then you're just going to beat all of these given. But much of the time, they can be handled with 1 or 2 counters. Sometimes you want to have some amount of redundancy, because say if Snorlax is your only Zapdos counter, for example, and Zapdos hacks your life. It gets the full paralysis and a critical hit and kills your Snorlax. Well, if you don't have another Zapdos answer, you just lost that game. Or if you needed or Snorlax to do something else because they're overloading on special attackers, and one of those special attackers manages to get through your Snorlax, well, now Zapdos has a field day, right? Rock Slide Spams. Rock Spam is a freaking terrible thing to face if you don't have a lot of rock resist, or if you're not resilient to the Pokemon Tyranitar and Aerodactyl in the long run. So you definitely want to have things to help with that, because a lot of those games, they're just like 1 or 2 flinches away from just running away with it. And of course, all of these other win conditions. You could even throw in like Agility Metagross, for example. Like there are things that can sweep through your teams, and you definitely want to have things to either stop them from getting the setup, or manage to live their hits when they go for their setup attacks. So yeah, you may be able to get away with just 1 or 2 counters, though. It may not be the entire team-wide effort to get there. I mean, we could even argue maybe Blissey, if you have like maybe 1 game plan for it, like your Gengar Boom to Dugtrio, and then 1 physical attacker that might just be enough to handle the Blissey. But you do have to keep some of this stuff in mind, though, and formulate that game plan, because Blissey in particular is hellacious if you cannot kill it. So that's going to basically do it for this video. This is longer than some of my other ones, but I'm sure most of you are happy about that. As we get into the next parts, we're going to be talking about how to optimize your sets for particular roles, which is going to be a big calculator special. So I hope that you're into that, and if you're not into that, well, I don't know what to say to you. We're going to look at what you do when you're testing a team, as well as look at the 3 tips that our good buddy Benji has for analyzing games. And then we're going to put some theory to praxis. We're going to test what we've said and try to do a team build for a video. And then we'll answer some questions that arise through the course of the series, of course. If I'm not getting to your comments, just keep spamming me. I mean, that's going to be great for engagement, at least. No, don't spam, but definitely leave your questions as you have them in the comments, and I will try to get to as many of them as I can. So there we have it, and I hope that you all have a fantastic week.